This is my 1975 Chevy Camaro that I'm restoring with no knowledge of how to work on cars, to prove to the world that anyone can learn incredible new skills. And then, when it's all done, I'm giving it away to my mom. Before we embark on this thrilling new episode, let's take a moment to recap the incredible journey we've been on so far. In the first 3 episodes, we witnessed the resurrection of this classic beauty, overcoming rust, rebuilding the engine, and tackling a ton of challenges along the way. So far, I've repaired the floor pans and the trunk pans, replacing all the nasty rusted metal with fresh new panels. I dove into the heart of our Camaro, a horribly uncared for Chevy 350. With no prior experience, I learned as much as I could about engine rebuilding and transformed the non-running Chevy 350 into a powerhouse of performance with upgraded pistons, heads, intake manifold, and a powerful Howard's camshaft. I've also completed the installation of the new braking system, transmission rebuild, and transmission install. And now, in this latest installment, we continue the journey, addressing transmission fluid leaks, testing the transmission and the brakes, troubleshooting more issues, and finally, going for our first drive. The road to restoration is never easy, but my unwavering dedication will keep driving this project forward. At the end of the last episode, I ran into a horrible transmission fluid leak. That is where our kickdown cable was supposed to go, which I forgot to install. So now we're dripping transmission fluid everywhere. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and see if I can just connect this kickdown cable from here. Hopefully we don't have to go underneath the transmission now because there's fluid everywhere. So we probably lost about half a quart of transmission oil by doing that. So I'm going to put the rest of this in here, and then I've got a little extra for a backup. All right, we stopped the leak that was coming from the kickdown cable, but now we have a small trickle coming from where the actual filler pipe connects. So I'm assuming we probably need a new O-ring or something on that. So I'm going to leave that in there for now just so it doesn't flood out all over the floor. And I'm going to have to clean up this mess from our spill earlier. So instead of just replacing the O-ring, we actually got a brand new dipstick tube that has the nice little rubber foot on the end of it. So this is gonna plug it up a whole lot better than an O-ring ever will. Let's get this one swapped out. All right, old one's out. And we're gonna wait for the transmission fluid to stop leaking out before we put the new one in. All right, we got the new dipstick in. It is sealing super nice. I'm very happy with it. We are, however, gonna need some sort of bracket to help secure it because right now this tube is really loose and I don't want it to be that loose. So we're gonna have to figure out some way to hook that up to either the head or the firewall or something because right now where it is not very sturdy. Now, when I first got the engine started, I had just dropped a carburetor on top of it and hoped for the best. But for optimal engine performance, we need to time the engine and get the carb fully tuned for maximum power and efficiency. The carburetor is the heart of the fuel delivery system, and a well-tuned carb ensures optimal engine performance. So I start by adjusting the idle mixture screws to find the perfect balance of fuel and air for a smooth and consistent idle. Next, I adjust the idle speed screw to drop our engine's idle RPM a bit, since right now it's running a little fast. With these adjustments made, we move on to fine-tuning the engine's timing. An engine's timing at its core is when the air-fuel mixture is ignited inside the cylinders. If you ignite the mixture before the piston reaches the top of the cylinder, you create a very efficient and powerful explosion, but if it ignites too soon, it can cause the engine to stall when running, and in severe cases can actually destroy your engine over time. On the flip side, if your engine ignites the spark after the piston reaches the top of the cylinder, the engine will be much less powerful and doesn't allow you to take advantage of the full range of its potential horsepower. By rotating the distributor and checking our timing with a timing gun, we can fairly easily set the timing of the engine to 12 degrees advanced, which means it's firing just slightly before the piston reaches the top of the cylinder. By the end of this process, we achieve a harmonious balance between fuel and air, resulting in improved throttle response, better fuel efficiency, and overall enhanced engine performance. Fine-tuning the carburetor is like unlocking the true potential of our Camaro's engine, taking it from good to exceptional. Now with the powertrain tuned in, we need a way to start our car without jumping it off of an external battery. So let's tackle the intricate task of installing the wiring. Did you ever lick 9-volt batteries as a kid? Because I did, unsurprisingly. But since that day that I first learned about electricity, I hated it. I hated everything to do with wiring and electronics, and now here I am holding a $1,000 box of wires that are about to go into my car. Now it's time to figure out how to put all of that into this. We're starting with the interior harness to get everything wired up on the inside of the car. This will then allow us to wire in the ignition circuit and everything that's needed to get the car to actually start with the key, which is kind of the primary purpose of us getting the wiring in at this point in the build. After this, we have a bunch of other harnesses here that are eventually going to go in, but this is number one, so we're starting here. The wiring harness is the nervous system of our Camaro. It connects all the electrical components together. Most modern cars have about 10 times the amount of wires as this old girl, but it's still no easy task to wire a whole car. So in order to install the new modern fuse block into the car, it needs larger bolt holes. So we actually have to start by drilling out larger holes in the firewall to fit the new bolts in. There's one. And there's two. Once the new bolt holes were drilled out, I had to push the new fuse block up against the firewall, and you're gonna need a partner for this if you're doing it. Thankfully, my sister was around to help me out here, and she was able to screw it in from the backside while I held it on the inside. Then it was time to finally start wiring, and the instruction manual for this kit is incredibly detailed, as you can hear from the instructions my sister's about to read me here.
Tan white 18 gauge wire, printed 968 emergency brake switch. This is where we're at, and it goes through here to get that.
Once I had a few of the connections plugged in, it was time to start putting together some of the new hardware that was given in this kit. There's new door sensors, there's new light fixtures, there's a lot of new stuff included here, so we're gonna have to get all of that installed as well. Look for two things that look like bomb detonators.
It's labeled turn switch and has a black and pink, a light blue, a blue, and a brown.
Oh, you bastards. Oh, no.
What?
Some wiring kits will give you the turn switch pre-plugged into the connector that's needed for your model of car, but mine did not. I just had a bundle of raw wires hanging under the dashboard that I had to connect myself pin by pin into this custom connector that they gave me. Thankfully, following the instructions step by step was again very easy and allowed this to be much less complicated than it could have otherwise been. So we got everything installed in the interior of the car that we can for right now. We don't have any of the gauge clusters or the instrument panels or the radio or anything like that in. So now we're moving up to the front of the car and getting the ignition circuit finally set up. And hopefully this will be pretty straightforward. So step one of getting that front wiring harness connected is to plug it into the back of the fuse block through the firewall. Now this in theory should have been really easy, but for me it did take a couple of tries, so be very careful when playing around with these wires. You don't want to accidentally break anything. Better to be safe than sorry. Once it was plugged in, then it was time to start routing all of the wires throughout the engine bay to figure out where they would end up plugging in. Now, if there was one piece of advice I could give to somebody who's planning on wiring their own car, it would be invest in a good pair of wire strippers and crimpers. I picked up this cheap pair off of a Tractor Supply, and it is just awful. I had to bang, hammer, squeeze, crush, and otherwise deform my wires just to get this thing to work, and I do not recommend them at all. Definitely go ahead and invest the money if you're doing wiring like this. Get the good tool for the job. Now again, following the instructions makes this process super easy. They provide all of the connectors that are needed for these wires, so if you're following along, you go step by step, you get the connector in, and then it plugs right into the place that it's supposed to be in my distributor, because this is the coil wire that we're working on right now, and it plugged in, no problems at all, and we were good to go with the first connection in our engine bay. So one by one, I followed the instructions and connected all of the wires that were needed for the ignition circuit. The tach, the coil, the oil pressure sensor, the coolant temperature sensor, and then we reached the alternator and started running into problems with our crimping tool. No matter what I tried to do to crimp the connection onto the end of the cable, it was just too thick. Even though the crimpers were rated for a cable this thick, it would not crimp it. So I had to bust out my hammer and start pounding on the tool just to get it to properly crimp this connection. And then with a single nut and a little rubber boot, this connection was securely fastened to the alternator and we were ready to continue on our way. Next step was installing the final 2 alternator wires, which were easy to follow. You plug them into this little 2-prong connector and then they pop right into the alternator. Depending on the type of alternator that you have, the configurations are different, so just follow the instructions. So as we near completion of the ignition circuit, it is time to start wiring the battery cables. This big thick red cable goes basically directly to the positive terminal on the battery, and there is a fuse spliced in the middle. Now this is a great example of, again, how awful these wire cutters slash crimpers were, because I could not get it to cut this wire whatsoever. I ended up having to swap these out for an actual pair of tin snips to get this wire cut in half and splice that fuse in the middle. Splicing the fuse is super simple. It's the same process as crimping a connector on the end of each wire again, and then reconnecting it through the fuse circuit. So once that fuse is spliced into the wire, I could add the final connector to the end, and then it's ready to be hooked up to battery power. And the final wire in the ignition circuit that we need to connect is the starter solenoid power. And this one's fairly easy. It just connects to the bottom of the starter solenoid and screws right in, and then we should have a completed ignition circuit. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a battery yet for this car, so I had to steal one out of my girlfriend's car in the driveway. Hopefully she won't get mad at me about this, because it's about to be used to power on our new circuitry in this car for the first time ever, and I'm so excited to hear this thing turn over with the new wiring. Are we ready? It works. In theory, the wiring works. But as with any major overhaul on a car, something of course had to be wrong, because no matter how much I cranked this thing, it just would not start. Now, being that we just installed a whole new electrical system, my first thought, of course, went to maybe there's something plugged in the wrong place. And sure enough, it turned out that the first connection we made under the hood, the coil wire for the distributor, was not plugged in properly. So with the wiring installed and our transmission leaks fixed, it's time to put the gears to the test. I carefully engage each gear, ensuring smooth transitions and no unusual noises. I test the shifting under different driving conditions, from gentle acceleration to more aggressive shifting. My goal is to ensure the transmission operates flawlessly, delivering power to the wheels and providing the car with a seamless driving experience. With each successful gear change, I feel a surge of excitement as our Camaro comes alive once more. Now, safety is paramount, so before hitting the road, we must put our newly installed braking system through rigorous testing. We ran into a bad brake line leak earlier in the series, and Inline Tube sent us out a fresh new line to replace the broken one. With that one installed, our leaks were fixed, and we can finally test the brakes. When the car isn't in gear, the brakes worked fine. Push it. All right. But as soon as that powerful Chevy 350 comes to life, the idle torque is way too much for the brakes to hold back. Until I realized a simple mistake I had made. The engine is so powerful that the brakes currently cannot stop the car. But then I realized that my brake master booster here had not been plumbed in yet. So we gotta connect this vacuum hose to the carb, and then we should be able to get enough braking power to stop the car. So now with the brake booster plumbed in, we're gonna go ahead and start it up and see if we can get the brakes to work. It's a heart-pounding moment as I validated that the braking system is functioning flawlessly, and it provided me with the confidence to finally take this beauty for its first drive. I got nervous that something may already be wrong, and reversed it back up into the garage to check for any obvious problems so far. My alignment's a little bit funky. It doesn't steer the way that I want it to yet, but it moves! It rolls! Oh my god. I wanna actually drive it, bro. Just as I was reaching the peak of my excitement for getting this old car driving again, disaster struck. Oh, we're leaking oil bad. We're leaking oil real bad. Oh boy. So our first test drive went incredibly well. I am unbelievably excited to have this thing up and running now, but not all is sunshine and rainbows, unfortunately. We have a severe oil leak. Down here under the car, you can see all this oil puddling up down here. And I've realized that it's coming from the timing chain cover right up under there. After letting the engine cool down, I realized that the leak was actually coming from the rear of the oil pan, which was only using cork gaskets with a tiny bit of gasket maker. When I installed these gaskets during the engine rebuild, I was already worried it might spring a leak, and sure enough, here we were. Faced with the daunting possibility that I might need to pull the engine completely out of the car again, I decided to attempt a few shortcuts to save myself a little time. I have a couple different ways that I think that I might be able to do this, including dropping the oil pan just a couple inches, sneaking the oil pan gasket underneath the crankshaft, and pulling it up on the other side, and hopefully that will allow us to install this without taking the entire engine out of the car, or at least without having to lift it a significant amount. Now obviously, in order to get the oil pan gasket replaced, we're going to have to get the oil out of the oil pan. So let's start with draining the pan into our little bucket underneath, This is officially the first oil change that I've done on the new engine since the rebuild and install, so that's pretty cool. I didn't notice any chunks of metal or anything odd that would end up in the oil, so that is a really, really good sign that the engine is running properly and we don't have strange little metal shards everywhere. Now, once the oil pan is done draining, we're going to go ahead and plug it up and start unbolting the oil pan from the bottom of the engine. Now, a lot of people probably don't know that a lot of the old GM cars were really easy to remove the oil pans on. The cross member for the engine was about 6 inches further forward on a lot of their other vehicles, and for some reason, the Camaro got it 6 inches pushed back, which made it literally impossible to remove the oil pan without doing a lot of finicky work here. But after all of the oil pan bolts were out, we were able to get it to drop down about 3 inches. Now, that's not a lot of clearance when you're working with an engine, but it was enough to give me hope that I could actually slide the oil pan gasket under the crankshaft and pull it up on the other side, and we wouldn't need to pull the whole oil pan out. But before I was willing to put any gasket anywhere near this engine, we had to prep the surfaces, which meant rubbing everything down with lacquer thinner. Now, a lot of people use a lot of different things for this, but I like to lacquer thinner. It's pretty cheap, it's good to pour on a rag, and you can just wipe everything down with it. It's relatively clean, makes the process really easy, and it allowed me to prep the block and the oil pan surfaces for the new gasket to go in. So with the gasket surfaces properly prepped, it was time to see if I could thread the gasket through underneath the crankshaft and pull it up on the other side to get the gasket lined up and able to be installed. Now, if you're following along and you want to try and do this yourself, do not pause the video and go do it right now. This did not work. I'm just going to tell you that right now. This concept of threading it down underneath was the single worst idea I've had in the entire time of working on this car, and I will explain why momentarily. But I wanted to get it out of the way that if anyone is actually following this, do not follow in my footsteps. It is not as easy as it sounds. Now, the biggest problem that I ran into while trying to do this was the fact that I could not get it low enough into the oil pan to clear the oil pickup. Now, that should have been a no-brainer from the beginning, knowing the anatomy of an engine, but for some reason I brain farted and just could not remember the fact that it was there. So I spent almost an hour struggling to pull it through and just kept getting hung up on the oil pickup every single time. I wasted tons of time attempting to do this, and I definitely don't recommend it. So after inevitably failing to do this for about an hour and a half going into 2 hours, I decided, let me see if I can lift the engine up just a little bit, and hopefully that will give me enough clearance to fit the oil pan gasket through. I'm lifting it just enough to give myself more clearance, but not high enough to warrant taking anything off, adjusting the motor mounts, or worst case, breaking something. It was just a couple extra inches to let me feed the gasket through, and this actually worked. Now, even though lifting it up a little bit more gave me the clearance to feed the gasket through, it was still getting really dirty and oily as I pulled it through, and that's not great for sealing. But I figured it's a big one-piece gasket, it's better than the nasty old cork ones that I had on there, and so I decided to start moving forward and try aligning everything by putting some bolts in. And I'll just let this speak for itself. If you guessed that that was the sound of me dropping an oil pan bolt down inside of the oil pan, you would be correct. So now I was left with literally no choice other than to pull the whole oil pan off, because there was no other way that I was going to be able to get that bolt out. So I proceeded to unbolt the motor mounts, take the bolts out, and lift it the rest of the way up to finally give myself the clearance needed to pull the entire oil pan off the engine. Well, we're finally in the end game of replacing this oil pan gasket. As you saw, I had to hoist the engine up a couple inches out of the engine bay just to get enough clearance to finally pull that oil pan. I tried just about everything that I could to get this thing out, and it's finally out. So lesson learned, if you just do it right the first time, you'll probably get it done a lot quicker. So the next steps here is I'm going to clean all of the surfaces again with my lacquer thinner, get all the oil and gunk off of them, and then I'm going to fix the gasket because we got it a little bit bent up. We're going to put the proper RTV on all of the corners, and hopefully we can just stick the oil pan back up under the block and everything goes easy. But we all know how that usually goes, so fingers crossed. So once again, we start wiping everything down with the lacquer thinner and then move on to dabbing RTV on the corners where all of these gasket surfaces are gonna meet. So on the 4 corners of the oil pan, and then also we put RTV on the 4 corners of the block. And that just helps make sure that we get a really good seal when this oil pan gasket goes in. That is the failure point that I had last time and the entire reason that I have to deal with this. So I am going a little bit overboard on the RTV in hopes that I never have to do this again. So rolling ourselves back underneath the engine with the gasket stuck down to the oil pan surface, we're going to slowly wedge it back up into place. And this actually went surprisingly well. I was able to move it into place under the block really easily. And as I slowly wiggled it around to get it fully aligned on the block, I started putting in the big 4 corner bolts just to hold the oil pan up. Now these were not snugged down immediately because I wanted to make sure that we could still align the rest of the bolts and the gasket as we put the smaller bolts in. So then we started with the inside out bolting method and went one by one installing all of the small oil pan bolts until we had the oil pan fully seated back in the car. Whew! We finally got the oil pan back on. It is RTV'd, it's sealed, it's bolted back in place, and we finally have it in. With the new oil pan gasket installed on the car, it was time to fire it back up again to check for any remaining leaks. But we encounter yet another hurdle. Our engine suddenly refuses to start and run consistently. Starting to become a bit annoyed, I dug into the options of why it might not be working. I checked fuel delivery, spark plugs, ignition systems, and more. I meticulously examined each component, making adjustments just to see if anything simple would fix our problem. I started by checking our battery to see if it was dead, and with an 11.5 volt reading instead of the expected 12.2-ish volts, I knew something was wrong immediately. I took the battery back to the store and told them it wasn't holding a charge, and they happily recharged it for me back to 12.3 volts and sent me on my way, verifying that the battery itself was fine and had just been used too much. So if my battery was good, but was dying every time I ran the engine, that could only mean one thing. The alternator was bad. I took the alternator to the store where they tested it for me to find out if it was really bad or not.
Passed.
With proof that the alternator itself was properly working, that left me with the possibility that I had wired the alternator incorrectly. So I headed back to my wiring manual to see if everything looked right, which is when I found out that my alternator exciter wire, which is responsible for providing a basic 12 volt power source to the alternator, wasn't connected properly. And because it wasn't connected, it was keeping the alternator from actually generating any power. So with the wire fixed and the electrical system charged up again, I gave the engine a crank, hoping to see it run flawlessly. It still wouldn't stay running. Eventually, I reached back out to my engine experts and asked them for help. They recommended checking to see if the carburetor was clogged, potentially by some dirt that had gotten into my little red fuel tank that I had been using. So I think we've narrowed down our no start issue to the carburetor. I think it's a fuel delivery issue because fuel is getting to the fuel filter, but it's not getting all the way up to the carb. At least that's what it seems like. I know the bowls are filling up properly, but for some reason the fuel just isn't spraying in when we need it to. So I'm gonna spray some carb cleaner through here, see if that helps at all, and fingers crossed that'll be our issue. Now my camera died while taking the carburetor apart, but I cleaned all the channels and holes with Carb Cleaner and found that a part of the carb called a float needle was stuck wide open, which was allowing fuel to just freely flow into the engine and was causing it to stall out from too much fuel. So I cleaned that up, buttoned everything back up with the carburetor, and gave it a crank to see if I could get it running again. Now to you guys, that only took a few minutes to fix our engine and get it running again, but in reality that took me almost 2 weeks to figure out what was wrong with it. And one of the biggest issues when you work on cars is figuring out what the problems are with them, which is why I've partnered up with Launch to show you how easy it can be to figure out what's wrong with your car. Now I'm about to make a 700-mile move from Kentucky down to Florida, so I need to know everything is good with my truck before I head on that trip. So I'm going to use the Launch reader here and figure out if there's any code stored on my truck that I might need to fix before I can go down. And with the quick push of a couple buttons, I find out every single system that's on my truck and every single thing that's wrong with it. And it looks like here I have a payload overcapacity issue. That's not a current issue. I need an oil change, I know that much. And there's also a tire pressure sensor code here, which I don't know what that's from, but I know all my tires are up to spec, so I'm good to go. So all we do is clear out these codes and make sure that they don't come back, and that is how easy it is to find out if your car is ready to go. Now this is one of the most in-depth computer systems that I've ever had the pleasure of using. This thing can program keys, it can check ECUs, it can check data codes. There's so much more that this thing can do than any other OBD2 reader that I've bought. And Launch did send this to me for free to help me out with all of my car projects, so if you guys are interested in getting a computer for yourselves, I definitely recommend these. They're super high quality, they've got touch screens on them, they feel super durable, plus they ship it to you in this crazy heavy duty case, so even when you're out in the garage working, you're throwing stuff around and stuff's falling off your workbench, this thing's gonna stay pretty secure. So again, big shout out to Launch for sending this over to me. It'll definitely help me figure out all the problems with all of my other cars that actually have computers. That being said, let's get back to the Camaro. It's been a whirlwind of challenges and successes in this episode of our Chevy Camaro restoration, and I keep learning more and more about how these magnificent machines work. As I reflect on my progress, it's important to acknowledge that restoration projects are not without setbacks. They remind us of the complexities involved and the importance of perseverance. Our commitment to this project drives us to overcome obstacles and deliver the best results possible. So needless to say, we've made a ton of progress on this build so far. We've got our transmission shifting, we've got our brakes working, and we finally went for our first drive. Now, pretty much the last thing to do here is to get the car looking good again and getting the interior finished up again. But we've still got a ton more content to come, so make sure you subscribe and click that notification bell so you never miss an upload on this series. And if you've been enjoying it so far, leave me a comment, let you know what's been your favorite moment so far in the build, and I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya!